Imagine inheriting the most powerful military arsenal in human history, and realizing within hours of taking office that you have absolutely no idea how to use it. That is exactly what happened to John Fitzgerald Kennedy on January 20th, 1961, the day he was sworn in as the 35th President of the United States. The world saw a young, charismatic leader standing in the bitter Washington winter cold, delivering one of the most celebrated inaugural addresses in American history. What the world did not see was the quiet terror building behind those famous eyes. Kennedy had just received his first classified nuclear briefing, and what he heard inside the walls of the White House left him visibly shaken. The men around him noticed it immediately. His hands were steady, his voice remained composed, but the color had drained from his face. He had just learned that the United States maintained a strategic nuclear arsenal capable of killing hundreds of millions of people, and that the decision to unleash it could come down to a window of time so impossibly small that it defied human comprehension. He needed answers, and there was only one man alive who could give them to him: his predecessor, the former Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, Dwight David Eisenhower. If this story already has you leaning forward, this channel is exactly where you need to be. Subscribe right now, hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves real history, and drop a comment below telling us what you didn't know before watching. Your reaction might just appear in our next video. Dwight Eisenhower had spent the entirety of his two presidential terms, from January 1953 to January 1961, living inside the nuclear nightmare that most Americans could only imagine as a distant, abstract threat. He was the president who authorized the development of the U-2 spy plane, who watched the Soviet Union detonate its first hydrogen bomb on August 12, 1953, and who understood with cold military precision what that event meant for the future of civilization. Eisenhower had built, brick by brick, the entire architecture of American nuclear deterrence. He had approved the creation of the Single Integrated Operational Plan, known as the SIOP, a terrifying strategic document that essentially pre-programmed the destruction of the Soviet Union, China, and their allies in a single coordinated nuclear strike involving thousands of warheads. He had signed off on the deployment of nuclear weapons to overseas bases in Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. He had sat through briefings that described, in cold statistical language, the projected death tolls of nuclear exchanges, numbers so enormous they lost all human meaning. When Kennedy walked into that first briefing, he was inheriting an infrastructure of annihilation that had been carefully constructed over 8 years, and he was inheriting it without a manual. The meeting between Kennedy and Eisenhower at Camp David on January 19, 1961, just one day before the inauguration, was one of the most consequential private conversations in the history of the Cold War, and almost none of it was recorded for posterity. The two men walked together on the snow-covered grounds of the presidential retreat in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland, speaking quietly, away from aides and photographers. Kennedy, then 43 years old and brimming with the nervous energy of a man about to assume an impossible burden, peppered Eisenhower with questions. But one question stood above all others in its urgency and its dread. Kennedy looked at the man who had commanded the Allied forces on D-Day, June 6, 1944, and asked him directly, how many minutes did the United States actually have to respond to a Soviet nuclear missile launch? The answer Eisenhower gave him was not a comfort. Depending on the trajectory and the type of missile, the window ranged from as few as 4 minutes to no more than 15. 15 minutes to decide whether to end civilization as humanity knew it. 15 minutes or less to make a choice that no human being should ever have to make. To understand why that number was so terrifying, one must go back to October 4, 1957, the night the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 into orbit above the Earth. The world heard that faint, rhythmic beeping signal transmitted from space, and most people celebrated it as a scientific marvel. Inside the Pentagon, however, the reaction was something closer to controlled panic. If the Soviets could place a satellite into orbit, they possessed the rocket technology to place a nuclear warhead on any city in the United States. This was the beginning of the era of intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ICBMs, weapons that traveled not through the air like conventional bombers but through the edge of space itself, following arching trajectories that radar systems of the late 1950s could barely detect in time. Eisenhower had known this moment was coming. He had secretly ordered the construction of the distant early warning line, a chain of radar stations stretching across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland and Iceland, designed to give the United States the maximum possible warning time. But even with all of that, the warning windows remained brutally short. When Kennedy learned these numbers in full, sitting inside the White House Situation Room for the first time, he reportedly turned to his national security advisor McGeorge Bundy and said words to the effect that this was not what he had expected, that the reality was far worse than anything his campaign advisors had told him. What made the situation even more alarming for Kennedy was the discovery that the Nuclear Launch Authority was not as tightly controlled as he had assumed. In the months following his inauguration, Kennedy and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, began digging into the actual command and control procedures for American nuclear weapons. What they found horrified them. Through a system of pre-delegated authority, field commanders, generals and admirals far below the level of the president, had been granted conditional authority to launch nuclear weapons under certain circumstances. This meant that, in theory, a nuclear war could begin not from Washington but from a command post in West Germany, from a naval vessel in the Pacific, or from an air base in Turkey, if a local commander believed an attack was imminent. The system had been designed by Eisenhower with a certain logic. If the Soviets managed to destroy Washington in a first strike, the United States needed to retain the capacity to retaliate. But to Kennedy, fresh eyes uncontaminated by the incremental compromises that had built this architecture, the entire arrangement looked like a catastrophic accident waiting to happen. McNamara, a former Ford Motor Company executive with a statistician's mind and a haunted conscience, immediately began pushing for what would become known as the flexible response doctrine, a radical rethinking of how America approached the nuclear question. By the summer of 1961, Kennedy's fears were no longer theoretical. On August 13, 1961, the East German government, backed by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, began constructing the Berlin Wall, sealing off West Berlin from the Communist East overnight. The crisis that followed brought the world closer to nuclear conflict than most people realized at the time. Kennedy mobilized reserves, sent additional troops to Europe, and delivered a nationally televised address on July 25, 1961, in which he asked Congress for a dramatic increase in military spending and explicitly invoked the possibility of nuclear war. The American public, sitting in their living rooms across the country, heard the President of the United States calmly discussing the prospect of nuclear conflict, and the sales of backyard bomb shelters spiked almost immediately. But behind closed doors, the situation was far more volatile than Kennedy's composed television demeanor suggested. He was receiving intelligence reports indicating that Soviet military exercises were simulating nuclear first strikes against Western Europe. The window of 15 minutes or less that Eisenhower had described to him in the snow at Camp David had become a daily reality. Not a hypothetical, but an active operational consideration that colored every foreign policy decision his administration made. If you have made it this far into the story, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Please subscribe right now if you haven't already. Give this video a like to help more people find this history. Share it with a friend who deserves to know what really happened behind closed doors. And leave a comment below. What part of this story surprised you most? The most terrifying test of everything Kennedy had learned came in October 1962. During 13 days that remain the closest the human race has ever come to deliberate nuclear self-destruction. On October 16, 1962, Kennedy was shown aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane over the island of Cuba, revealing the construction of Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites capable of striking Washington, New York, and virtually every major American city within 2 minutes of launch. 2 minutes. Not 15. Not 4. 2. The discovery compressed the already nightmarish decision window to something almost beyond the capacity of human reaction. Kennedy immediately convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as ExComm, a secret group of his most trusted advisors, including McNamara, his brother Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and CIA Director John McCone. The debates inside ExComm over the following days were extraordinary in their intensity and their moral weight. General Curtis LeMay of the Air Force argued for immediate airstrikes. McNamara advocated for a naval blockade. Robert Kennedy, the president's closest confidant, argued passionately against a surprise military attack, comparing it to Pearl Harbor in reverse. What very few people knew then, and what historians only confirmed decades later through declassified Soviet documents, was that the situation during the Cuban Missile Crisis was even more dangerous than Kennedy's advisors understood at the time. On October 27, 1962, later called Black Saturday, a Soviet submarine designated B-59, operating without radio contact and unaware that the crisis had not yet escalated to war, came under attack by American naval forces dropping practice depth charges to force it to surface. Inside that submarine, cut off from Moscow, operating in suffocating heat, the commander Valentin Savitsky concluded that war had already begun. He ordered the preparation of the submarine's nuclear torpedo, a weapon capable of destroying an entire aircraft carrier group. Under Soviet naval protocol, the launch required authorization from 3 officers. 2 agreed. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla commander who happened to be aboard, refused. One man's refusal to agree, on a submarine in the darkness of the Atlantic Ocean, on October 27, 1962, may have been all that stood between that moment and the end of the world. Kennedy, sitting in the White House, did not know about Arkhipov. He never would know, not in his lifetime. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis on October 28, 1962, when Khrushchev announced the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, brought enormous relief but no lasting peace of mind to Kennedy. If anything, the crisis had deepened his obsession with the command and control problem that Eisenhower had first introduced to him in the snow at Camp David. In the months that followed, Kennedy pushed hard for what became the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, signed on August 5, 1963, in Moscow, prohibiting nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. It was the first arms control agreement of the nuclear age, and Kennedy considered it among the most important achievements of his presidency. He also worked with the Soviet Union to establish the Moscow-Washington hotline, the famous red telephone, though it was actually a teletype machine, activated on August 30, 1963, to allow direct communication between the American president and the Soviet premier in times of crisis. Both measures were direct consequences of what Kennedy had learned from Eisenhower, from his briefings, and from the terrifying reality of those 13 days in October. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963, less than 3 months after signing the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. He was 46 years old. He had spent precisely 1,036 days in the White House, and in virtually every one of them, the question Eisenhower had answered for him in the snow, "How many minutes do we have?" had never left the edges of his consciousness. The legacy of that question did not die with him. It shaped every president who followed, from Lyndon Johnson to Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan, each of whom received their own version of that same terrifying briefing, each of whom had to learn to live inside the same impossible arithmetic of annihilation. The nuclear football, the briefcase carried by a military aide that follows the president everywhere, containing the launch authentication codes, became one of the most recognizable symbols of modern American power precisely because of the architecture that Eisenhower built and Kennedy inherited. The world that exists today, with its arms control treaties, its hotlines, its carefully constructed protocols for crisis communication, was built in direct response to those questions Kennedy asked, those fears he carried, and those 13 days in October when the answer to Eisenhower's grim mathematics very nearly became a lived reality for every human being on Earth. History is not made only in grand speeches and famous battles. Sometimes it is made in quiet walks through the snow, when one man asks another man a question that neither of them truly wants answered. If the story moved you or taught you something that school never did, now is the time to act. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Like this video to help it reach more curious minds. Share it with someone who needs to understand how close we have all come to the edge. And leave a comment below telling us what moment in the story stopped you cold. Because the history of the world often turns on moments so small and so human that we almost miss them entirely.